Mrs. Eddy by Hugh Studdert Kennedy. Chapter 20, Science and Health. It has been well said that anyone who commences to read the Bible as if it were any other book will quickly find that it is like no other book. The same is true in a measure of science and health. It is like no other book. There are no standards, either of literature, form, or content, by which it can be appraised. Perhaps the most revealing statement that ever was made in regard to it is Mrs. Eddy's own in the preface to the last edition, issued in 1908, where she says that until June 10, 1907, she had never read this book throughout consecutively. Between the appearance of the first edition in 1875 and the last in 1908, Science and Health ran through 382 editions. In many of these, changes of considerable importance were made, especially in the early editions. In the 16th edition, issued in 1885, the book was completely rearranged and to a large extent rewritten. And yet the author never read it through consecutively until it had been out more than 3 decades. Anyone, therefore, who expects to find in Science and Health the progressive unfoldment of a thesis in what he would regard as orderly advance from step to step, will quite certainly be disappointed. The chapter on prayer, with which the book now commences, was, until 1902, one of the later chapters of the book, while only 3 chapter headings appearing in the first edition are retained in the last. For these reasons, a review of Science and Health in the accepted meaning of the term must be impossible, whether in its first or last edition. It is, however, possible, and very readily possible, to grasp its purpose. And when this purpose is grasped, each chapter, practically each page, becomes a treatise on the fundamental issue, almost complete in itself. Mrs. Eddy, in her teaching, laid stress on the proposition that Christian Science differed from Orthodox Christianity in nothing, save that it was a step more spiritual. In other words, she places all the Christian virtues in the forefront of doctrine. Paul's famous summary, in his epistle to the Galatians, finds an honored place in Science and Health. Her purpose is to advance from the rudiments laid down. Her faith was that in the light of the great revolutionary dictum as to the allness of spirit and the consequent nothingness of matter, every Christian virtue would be revised outward and upward, until, as she puts it, joy is no longer a trembler, nor is hope a cheat. While not nearly so outspoken as the first edition, the last revision of Mrs. Eddy's book reduces most of her basic propositions from page-long dissertations down to brief paragraphs, and even, in some instances, to short sentences. Here is a typical passage from the first edition. Quote, "We learn from science, mind is universal, the first and only cause of all that really is. Also, that the real and unreal constitute what is and what is not. That the real is spirit, which is immortality, and the unreal matter, or mortality. The real is truth, life, love, and intelligence, all of which are spirit. And spirit is God, and God soul, the principle of the universe and man. Spirit is the only immortal basis. Matter is mortality. It has no principle, but is change and decay, embracing what we term sickness, sin, and death. God is not the author of these. Hence, spirit is not the author of matter. Discords are the unreal that make up the opposite of harmony, or the real that emanates truth and not error. Spirit never requires matter to aid it, or through which to act. No partnership or fellowship exists between them. Matter cannot cooperate with spirit, the mortal and unreal with the real and eternal, the mutable and imperfect with the immutable and perfect, the inharmonious and self-destroying with the harmonious and undying. Spirit is truth, matter its opposite, that is, error. And these two forces control man and the universe, and are the tares and wheat that never mingle, but grow side by side until the harvest, until matter is self-destroyed. For not until then do we learn ourselves spirit, and yield up the ghost of error that would make substance, life, and intelligence matter. God and his idea are all that is real primitively. All is mind, and mind produces mind only. Nature, reason, and revelation decide that like produces like. Matter does not produce mind, nor vice versa. We name matter error, it being a false claim to life and intelligence that returns to dust, ignored by spirit, that is supreme over all and knows nothing of matter. End quote. This thought is, in the final version, from 1908 on, embodied in one compact paragraph on page 468, which has become famous as the scientific statement of being. Beginning, there is no life, truth, intelligence, nor substance in matter. It declares mind all and immortal, with matter or error unreal and temporal, concluding that man is not material, he is spiritual. Science and health is simply the iteration and reiteration of these statements in many different forms. No matter what the subject under consideration, whether it be creation, marriage, spiritualism, atonement, healing the sick, or whatnot, sooner or later it will be found to lead up to a new view of the original thesis, the allness of God and the nothingness of matter. Science and health has been subjected to criticism from every point of view, few books more so. Sometimes, as in the case of Mark Twain's memorable Onslaught, the discussion was carried to the limits of the English-speaking world and beyond. Any attempt to traverse anew the field of these discussions, casting them into one comprehensive review, would be profitless as it would be tedious. It is a fact, however, that any biography of Mrs. Eddy must, as it moves from point to point, cover incidentally most phases of the long controversy linked as they so often are to momentous passages in her life. Mrs. Eddy's life, after the publication of Science and Health, was inextricably interwoven with her teaching. It would be impossible, therefore, to present any just picture of her life without, at the same time, discussing her teaching. And a discussion of her teaching in whatever phase involves her book, Science and Health. It has been often said that the movement came not out of the book, but that the book thrived because of the movement. In any event, the book of 1875 was almost stillborn. No one seemed to want it outside of its author's immediate circle. Members of this circle, however, certainly did everything in their power to get the book into circulation. Dorcas Rawson and George Barry made excursions into neighboring towns, literally hawking it from door to door and talking of the teaching it contained wherever they could find anyone willing to listen. Advertisements were inserted in local papers, accompanied by testimonies of healing, and copies were sent to libraries, universities, and many prominent and well-known people in various parts of the world. At first, there seemed to be little response, but after a time, the clouds began to break. Dorcas Rawson's and George Barry's vigorous frontal attack seems to have been, more or less, successful. Quite a number of copies of the book were sold and read by an ever-widening circle, with the result that almost from the first, the number of people seeking Mrs. Patterson's help and counsel increased greatly. The outside world, however, had been almost silent. And then one day Mary received a letter, the first of several, from no less a person than Bronson Alcott, the philosopher of Concord, the father of Little Women, and friend of Emerson and Longfellow. It was not just a simple acknowledgment, as some few had been. He had not only received the book, but had read it through, chapter by chapter, right to the end, and with growing enthusiasm. It must have been a wonderful letter for Mary to receive. The profound truths which you announce, sustained by facts of the immortal life, give to your work the seal of inspiration. Reaffirm in modern phrase the Christian revelation. In times like these, so sunk in sensualism, I hail with joy your voice, speaking an assured word for God and immortality. And my joy is heightened that these words are woman's divinings. He then goes on to say that reading her book has awakened an earnest desire to know more of yourself personally. And he adds, "May I then inquire if you would deem a visit from me an impertinence? If not, and agreeable to you, will you name the day when I may expect the pleasure of fuller interchange of views on these absorbing themes?" That letter was written on January 17th, 1876. And a few days later, the two met in Lynn. Bronson Alcott was one of those men whose place in the history of philosophy and letters seems to grow in importance as the years pass. In his day, although standing out vividly enough by himself, too vividly at times, His theories and methods were so utterly revolutionary as to carry them often, in the popular estimate, into the realm of fantasy. And so, although he was listened to eagerly wherever he went, and could hold audiences, large or small, enthralled by his marvelous conversational powers on an extraordinary variety of subjects, mostly transcendental in character, the effect on his auditors was, again and again, vitiated by the reckless way in which he forged ahead and left them to follow as best they could. He had no school of philosophy and never made any attempt to found one. As a consequence, his audience never quite knew what to expect. They could understand him and applaud or condemn according to their individual predilections when he launched out on his favorite topics, the primitive greatness of the child mind, or superior spiritual promise of the woman's. But they could not always follow him when he dwelt upon the illumination of mind and soul by direct communion with the creative spirit, or insisted on the all but audible spiritual counsel and monitions of external nature, or the invaluable benefits which must flow to man from serenity and simplicity. And yet Emerson could and did take the same ideas, catching from Alcott the inspiration behind them, and so present them as to make them intelligible and instantly acceptable to great multitudes. If there is such a thing, Alcott was and is a philosopher's philosopher, and as such is being steadily discovered. The teaching of Mary Patterson was just the kind to attract such a mind. The position she took up and claimed to prove as to the allness and consequent ever-presence of God, Spirit, only went a step further than his own theory of direct communion. And so, after he had read Science and Health, he was eager to meet its author. We have no description of their first meeting in Lynn, but that Bronson Alcott was far from being disappointed is evidenced by his next letter to Mary. It is written from Concord and dated January 30th. It shows that he lost no time after his return in seeing Emerson and his circle and telling them all about it. Recalling his visit with pleasure, he speaks of her grace and charm, and of his desire for more intimate fellowship with her and her devoted circle. At a gathering in Emerson's home that week, he had spoken of her and her teaching. Mr. Emerson had heard of your book, it appeared, and the company listened to what I had to tell without disloyal criticism. After this manner, he hopes to advertise Mrs. Glover and her work, and feels she can trust his commendations anywhere. Perhaps the subject can be introduced next week when he is to meet the divinity students at Cambridge for conversation on divine ideas and methods. Meanwhile, Daniel Spofford and George Barry went forward with renewed hope in their efforts to develop the sale of Science and Health. Spofford was building up a very considerable practice. Besides his office in Lynn, he had opened offices also in Haverhill, Newburyport, and Boston. And as one of the main objectives of his work was to lead his patients on through their own healing to further study of the new teaching, he found a ready sale for Science and Health, which even at that early date was beginning to be regarded and spoken of as the textbook. Then some more or less favorable reviews were beginning to come in. The Springfield Republican had described the doctrines of the book as high and pure, and wholly free from those vile theories about love and marriage which have been so prevalent among the spiritualists. The Christian Advocate of Buffalo, New York, declared that the book was certainly original, not influenced by superstition or pride, but striking out boldly and alone, full of philanthropy, self-sacrifice, and love toward God and man. While the Boston Investigator summarized its view comprehensively enough by saying, "We shall watch with keen interest the results of Science and Health." The work shows how the body can be cured and how a better state of Christianity can be introduced, which is certainly desirable. It was, likewise, a hard thrust at spiritualism, and taken altogether is a very rare book. Such notices, combined with the favor of a man like Bronson Alcott, while Emerson and his pleasant circle at Concord listened without disloyal criticism, must have been more than welcome to Mary and her little band. As Bancroft puts it, such notices as these made us all very happy, and we gathered around our leader with renewed confidence in her and hope in the future of Christian Science. Meanwhile, the leader herself also seems to have enjoyed about this time one of those brief periods filled with the satisfaction of hope realized, which she enjoyed, or rather allowed herself to enjoy, so seldom. It is indeed a significant fact in Mrs. Eddy's whole life, but especially from now on, that although so many contemporary records comment on her cheerfulness, she never seems to have had much use for a cheerfulness which was begotten from what the world would call success. Later on, when she had become one of the world's best-known women, she wrote of herself, "I rejoice with those who rejoice, and am too apt to weep with those who weep. But over and above it all are eternal sunshine and joy unspeakable." She always gives the impression of one seeking this eternal sunshine. And the fact that she apparently found it again and again, even in the most difficult circumstances, is the only possible explanation for her serenity, which to an increasing extent was wont to amaze her friends and confound her enemies. To this ability may also perhaps be attributed the impression of extraordinary beauty, which she gave at times, and to which both her friends and her enemies alike bear testimony. She never seems to change very much. Almost the same words are used in describing her at 60 as at 16. Slim, alert, graceful, big gray eyes, deep set and overhung with dark lashes. Her skin clear, red, and white. So testified an old neighbor at Bow in 1836. Putney Bancroft in 1876, in his prim, formal style, presents much the same picture. He, too, speaks of her regular and finely molded features, of her eyes deep set, dark blue, and piercing, sad, very sad at times, yet kind and tender, of her splendid carriage, her slim, yes, well-rounded figure. 10 years later still, a student speaks of her as exquisitely beautiful, even to critical eyes. And 20 years after that, when Mrs. Eddy was in her 87th year, the matter-of-fact Arthur Brisbane finds this word, beautiful, the only word by which to describe her. But in these Lynn days especially, what seems to have made the most profound impression on her followers was Mary Patterson's self-sacrifice and devotion to her purpose. As Bancroft puts it, in all the years during which I knew her, Mrs. Eddy's life and her activities were dominated by this one idea, the promulgation of her theories. She was undoubtedly sincere in thinking that to be of more importance to the world than all else she had to offer. It was, on the other hand, just this devotion to purpose which betrayed Mary at this time into doing and saying many things and resorting to methods which time and experience, often most bitter experience, caused her later on to abandon. The conservatism and modesty, the obligation to respect the opinions of others, the policy of discretion, not to push forward aggressively, but to await alertly the appeal for help, the wisdom of restraint, and the paramount value of charity, which characterized her later teaching and actions, find little place in these early days. If the sick did not come to be healed, then let the practitioner of Christian Science go out and find the sick and heal them in spite of themselves. If any man reviled you or failed to appreciate your teaching in the public press, then a certain amount of judicious reviling in return was quite in order. If the practitioners of Materia Medica advertised themselves and the benefits of what they had to offer, then the practitioners of Christian Science should not hesitate to do the same and more also. Thus, when Bancroft wrote to Mary from Cambridge, complaining of his lack of patience and the apparent failure of his work, she told him sharply, in so many words, to stop growling and get to work. Do not stand still, she wrote. Make a stir. Go to the sick and heal them if they do not send for you. When an unfavorable review of Science and Health appeared in the Boston Globe, she did not hesitate to write to the paper, characterizing the review as stupid, the comments of the reviewer as of no value whatsoever, and the reviewer himself as one prevented by his own sensualism from a clearer perception of supersensual truths. All of which was possibly true, but in marked contrast with the restraint of her later years. Most startling of all, however, were some of the methods used to promote the sale of Science and Health. It is, of course, entirely possible that Mary Patterson, laboring under the ever-increasing burdens of a new movement, every step forward in which was into new country, had no knowledge of many of those means and methods until after they were an accomplished fact. Although it is to be admitted there is no record that she ever objected to such things. Anyway, in those days, characterized, as has been already noted, by the most extravagant claims from all manner of doctors and healers, they would not be nearly so offensive as they would be today. And yet, one of Spofford's efforts is startling enough. He got out a circular describing the book in the most extravagant terms, and also a handbill which reads like nothing so much as the advertisement for a patent medicine. It commenced, "A holiday present, something that will do good, science and health. Hundreds of invalids have been cured by reading it." Thereafter follow a series of some 10 or 12 testimonials from doctors and others testifying to the benefits they have received, and the names of booksellers in Boston from whom the book might be procured. Mary Patterson's bitter complaint to Putney Bancroft about this time, "My students disgrace my recommendation," would seem to have been often more than justified. Help, however, was near at hand, and from an unexpected quarter.